my name's Catherine, obviously, and I've been researching vaccines for 10 years now. I started researching when I was pregnant with my daughter, who's 10. And I went really deep into it. It was something, I do a lot of research on other things as well, but vaccines were the one primarily for me, basically, and why I looked into it and how shocked, and I mean shocked, because, like everybody else, I grew up believing that vaccines save lives. I was vaccinated as a child, or I had nowhere near as many vaccines as they do today. But, the information just wasn't there. It was just the thing, wasn't it? It was just, you didn't even question it then. It was just one of those, it's for the greater good, weird slogan things, a brainwashing tool without any questions ever asked. So I was like that myself until age 27. And I was sat down one day and my partner was out in the workroom and he was watching a documentary, and it's quite an old one now, but it's called Vaccination. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but basically it was about an American guy called Alan Yurko, who he was sent to prison for shaken baby syndrome. And it turns out that it actually wasn't shaken baby syndrome. It was vaccine damage, and the autopsy and everything proved it. He was in there for about 6 years. At one point, the FBI even went around to his wife and told her that she had to say that he shook the baby, but she knew that he didn't. And the autopsy and everything. He's released now anyway. But there are thousands of people in prison for shaken baby syndrome, and it is actually a side effect of vaccines. Is quite a common one. So that was the first thing I watched, and I was so startled by it. If you watch it, you'll see what I mean. It just
what's it called, Catherine?
And I was thinking,
what's it called, Catherine? I'll put it in the message box.
It's called Vaccination.
Yeah, that's the one.
It was the one that sent me on my journey anyway, because I think anyone to get triggered by it is going to look. Anyone else won't, unfortunately. Well, thankfully, that was my trigger moment, and I happened to be pregnant. It coincided the wrong time, really, because being 5 months pregnant and then coming to terms with this and research until 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, it was doing my head in. I had no sleep, and I was trying to carry my baby, but I had to know because I just couldn't believe it. And obviously one of those things that is going to come across more than anything, and it was for me, was the why, and how don't doctors and nurses know about it? That's the biggest question for everything, which then brings up the massive misconception that your doctor knows everything there is to know about vaccines, which he absolutely doesn't. And when I researched what a medical doctor actually does learn surrounding vaccinations in their standard 7-year med school, it's nothing. It's nothing. All they learn is they do, I think, 1 day on nutrition. Now, as we know, nutrition is our health. They do 1 day. The rest of it is pharmaceutical based. And that is it. They get given the schedule, the vaccine schedule, told to follow it. And that is exactly what they do. They don't know what's in them. Well, I say they don't. Some of them do. Obviously, they know, because these children are going in healthy babies. They're having a vaccine. The parents bringing them back the next day. You'd be a fool to not see that connection there. Especially, a doctor who's classed as, highly intelligent. So some of them do know. Unfortunately, lots of them get, as we know, Andrew Wakefield was a prime example of this. They made a massive example of Andrew Wakefield for what he said about the MMR. And anyone to actually read his paper, which many people don't bother, they just say, oh, he's a fraud, he's a liar, and this, that, and the other, and he was a quack, and he got struck off, and they took his license, which they did revoke his license. However, when you actually ask someone if they've read his paper, that specific paper that was actually, it was published in the Lancet for a few years before the controversy kicked in and people started to pick up on what he was saying. And then that's when they pulled it and they demonized him in through the mainstream media, which we all saw, of course. But yeah, basically what he did, he didn't even say in that paper, he didn't say the MMR causes autism. He said nothing of the sort. He was one of the top 5 best gastroenterologist specialists of the gut before this. So, you know, he was a very well-respected doctor around the UK. And basically, the only reason he did this study, and he got funding for it as well initially by them until it turned up the wrong thing, and then they obviously took it from him. But they did give him funding for it, and what it was, he was obviously just making that connection where the mum would go in, have the MMR, have the baby have the MMR, and the next day or the next few days or perhaps the next week or so, because vaccine reactions are not just immediate, they're cumulative and they can take a while. And they were all coming back saying the classic signs of regression, which is loss of eye contact, no communication, they don't answer to their name anymore. Maybe if they were walking, they've stopped walking, they start screaming, they're in pain basically because their brain damage, their brain is swelling. So when the parents were taking them back and saying there was some connection because he obviously saw it. It was obvious what the connection was, but he did a study and they funded it. So what he did was he took samples of, I think it might have been 12 children with their parents' consent, and he studied them at a lab. And what he found was every single one of those children had inflammation of the measles virus in the small intestine, every single one of them. He didn't say the MMR caused autism. He said all of these symptoms are the same, and where did it come from? Well, the answer was it came directly through the vaccine. This was why they picked up on what he was saying, and this was why they shot him through the media, and because vaccination rates were dropping, and that's what typically happens when vaccination rates drop. They put out a media campaign, pure propaganda to haul you in. For an example, I think it was about 20 years ago, there was an article which said low vaccination rates cause pertussis, which is whooping cough, outbreak in Idaho. Right, okay, so that was the headline. What they failed to tell you with that study was that 86% of them were fully vaccinated, meaning that they definitely had the pertussis vaccine anyway. 14% of them were partially vaccinated, and only one of them was completely unvaccinated. But these are the bits that they leave out of they leave that out for obvious reasons for their agenda. So anyway, going back to when I started, and I started to then be more conscious of making connections and seeing it. And I really noticed it then. And you guys will as well. I'm 37. So when I was in school, right, it was very, very unheard of. I was born in 1983, so I would have had about 10 doses of vaccines, right, by age 6, and none after that. Now is 74 doses by age 6. 74 doses by age 6. Most of them come within the first 2 years of life, which is insane because they know that the blood-brain barrier isn't even developed until age 2, meaning anything that goes into that bloodstream travels to the brain. So, it's quite intentional how all this happens. But yeah, so when I was in school, there was hardly anyone, I don't remember anyone with a hearing aid, because ear infections and ear problems are another very, very common vaccine reaction. People just sort of don't even make the connection and just say, bad ears, bad, but it is actually a vaccine reaction. Well, there was nobody, I remember in school, hardly anyone wore glasses. Everyone was healthy. There was no autism, there was none of that, and that was as early as back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But then if you look now, and you can ask any teacher who's sort of taught then from the, before the 70s or the 70s upwards, they'll tell you themselves. And what they try and say to you is, we didn't know then. We just the diagnosis wasn't there, and we just didn't know as much. I'm telling you now, you would definitely have noticed 10, 12-year-old children in nappies with helmets on, screaming in absolute agony, pain, so much. You didn't notice those? Bullshit. They do know, you notice those. And that's what they've used. They've used that to pretend that there isn't a massive, there's an epidemic, all right. It's the elephant in the room. The epidemic is childhood brain damage, and everybody ignores it. It's gone up something like, it's not a genetic mutation. It's gone up 900% in 3 decades. It's impossible. We know what it is. We know what the connection is. It's just they're turning us away from it, or attempting to. But yeah, so growing up, we know that the connection is there, obviously, and it is being massively hidden. Although, from all the research I've done over the years, there's plenty of evidence there, even within the peer review that you always get thrown at. Oh, I want to see all the peer review. Well, there is. I think people just say that just to sound like they know what they're on about or something. I don't know, because I'm like, well, there's 10 of them. Which ones do you want? It's cherry picking information to suit. And, don't get me wrong, it's a horrible thing to have to come to terms with, especially for all the thousands of parents who've got vaccine damaged children. There's a level of guilt there. And if we don't know, we don't know. And had I not, maybe if I'd not been with Darren, or I'd chosen a different path, and I didn't have that conversation with him, and he didn't watch that documentary that day, I could have been in a, so I understand that. But I don't think at this point anyone could deny that the evidence isn't there anymore. It's absolutely crazy. The neurological damage that's caused directly through vaccination is, and something to point out as well, before I get off on something else, going back to me being born in 1983. In 1986, so before 1986, vaccine industries and vaccine companies were held liable for any damage, right? But they got to a point where they were paying that much out in damages that they couldn't afford it. So they went to Congress in the 1980s and said, we're not going to be doing vaccines anymore because, we're running the things that are coming in, the damages that are coming in, and we can't keep up with it, right? And because the common thing at the time was that vaccines were so amazing that they saved lives, to save face, and they were like, well, okay, we'll put you in some liability. And didn't they just? So in 1986, the vaccine industry became completely immune from any prosecution at all to do with their products. They are the only industry you cannot be insured for. Nuclear war, acts of God, and vaccines. You can be insured for anything else in the world except those, and that's got to scream out anyway. But yeah, so what they did then in 1986 is they brought out the Vaccine Injury Act, right? So basically, they set up compensation schemes around the world, which is funded by the taxpayer, by the way. And you have, so when you go, if you want to get compensation, you have to fight the government for that. And that is the loops that you have to jump through. So if we have a look at this on a bigger scale, only about 8% of the population makes a connection between the vaccine and the damage, right? Only 8%. Now, those 8%, if whatever percentage of that want to go on to get compensation, only 2% ever go on to be compensated. And you report these, it's called VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Report System, right? And they have paid out, even in the USA, billions, but only from a very, 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 very tiny amount of cases, really, because even doctors underreport vaccine injury by 90%. 90%. And I read, it was a nurse actually about 2 years ago, and she was really honest, and she knew the score on vaccines, and she just or she's probably lost her job, but she put up a big post about she is the only one. She works in the ER in in America. I think she's a registered nurse in America, and she works in a big ER out there. And she said she was the only one that was reporting vaccine injury, and that is all they were seeing, because that's what happens. You've assaulted that's, of course they're going to scream. You've missed every line of defense going. So when we consume things, then our bodies are great. They get rid of 99% of the toxicity anyway on its own, because our organs are working fine. But once you inject foreign, well, what's in there? We've got mercury in the form of thimerosal, basically, which is a derivative of mercury, and a neurotoxin, a known one. You've got aluminium, which is a known neurotoxin, causes brain inflammation and Alzheimer's. We've got MSG, which is monosodium glutamate, which is an excitotoxin. It causes free radical damage in the brain. We've got diseased monkey kidneys. We've got pig's blood. We've got aborted fetal tissue. We've got polysorbate 80, polysorbate 20, antibiotic. You've got a whole host of foreign chemicals being directly injected into the blood. So there's no chance of those being passed through the first several forms of defense. It's an assault to the body. It's gone straight into the blood. And because the proteins in vaccines are not found in the bloodstream naturally, they're too big. So what happens is they sit in the bloodstream and they putrefy, they rot. So then the byproduct, the toxicity coming off that then is phenomenal. And it goes around, and you'll notice with people, you'll see it, people will say, in a vaccine injured baby, you'll know it straight away, because when you try and change their nappy, you will just be hit with the most toxic smell. And it's not a poo smell, it's a metal smell, and it will burn the baby's bum, and there's a lot of bowel issues that go on. Sorry, my dog's barking outside. A lot of bowel issues is one of the biggest indicators. One of the most obvious is the bowels. So yeah, basically, when you're assaulting the body in that way, it's no wonder it's causing what it does. And all of this, all of the vaccine. Sorry, my dog's barking. He never normally does it either. I swear it's because he knows I'm by here.
Never work with children.
Everyone's trying to shut him up. I can hear everyone shutting him up downstairs. They're going, shh. It's all right. I think somebody's come in my back gate. That's what it is. And he's a Doberman, so he's like, woo, 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 woo. Sorry, where was I then? Yeah, sorry. Under the only reason anyone gets vaccinated is because they fear the disease that apparently the vaccine is supposed to protect you from. That is the only reason, otherwise you wouldn't do it. So when you realize that all previous, and I'm going to have to go into detail about this again, I think, especially talking about the germ and the terrain theory, because it throws up a lot of questions, obviously, like, well, what happened to smallpox? What happened to polio? What happened to these? Doctors only get, so in their medical textbooks, they get post 1940. That's what they get. So it looks like the vaccine has come in. So all these, you'll show the little bit before where they were on the decline. The vaccine comes in and takes credit for it, right? And this is repeated throughout. This is in all medical books. But if you go back before 1940, the statistics speak for themselves. You see they decline. They're all on the decline up to 90%. 90%, every single one of them. And there was one reason only for that. And it's so simple, it repels the mind, because they've managed to build a pharmaceutical industry based on a lie. Back in the early 1900s, people were living in shit, basically. There was sewage running down the street. There was no plumbing. There was poor living conditions, poor nutrition, poor hygiene. It was a toxic soup. And that's why people were getting ill. And in fact, according to statistics, and the only official statistics available from London, concluded that the smallpox vaccine, smallpox attained its maximum mortality after the vaccine was introduced. And a really good example of that would be Leicester, because during compulsory vaccination of smallpox, when everyone was just dying, everyone was just, the conditions were awful. They were being injected, their limbs were falling off. It was no vaccine. It was a scratch off the top few layers of your skin, open wounds, and put in powdered cowpox. You're just looking for infection there, So basically that's what was going on. But what Leicester did is they stopped their vaccination program. They were the only ones at the time as well. And what they found was, surprise, surprise, people stopped dying. People stopped dying of smallpox, right? Bearing in mind that everyone else surrounding Leicester was still going and they were still dropping like flies. It's a really good one to research. That one is for that reason. It shows you about the epidemics that have been created by the CDC. And in fact, we've just given smallpox as a one example. It's the same thing with polio. What happened with polio is that it was reclassified. So basically, instead of calling it polio after mass vaccination, they called it aseptic spinal meningitis. They renamed it, and they do this with all diseases. They put them in, they're identical symptoms, but they make different names for them, so then they can sell you the cure or give you the vaccine. That's what they've always done. It's really quite, it's sick and it's twisted, and it needs to stop, because there is absolutely no benefit to vaccines whatsoever. They are literally a bioweapon. And all they do, and they do a good job of it as well, unfortunately, is they create customers for the pharmaceutical industry from the minute they are born, or even earlier if they can get a pregnant mother to have vaccines, which, by the way, they never, ever, ever used to do. Is something quite recent, really. Well, I say recent, but in the terms of how long vaccination's been around, I would say the past 13, 14 years. The flu, you shouldn't give any pregnant woman a vaccine of any kind, because that baby or that fetus is so vulnerable at that point, as you can well imagine. It's developing, and that's you directly go into the bloodstream. It goes to the baby. It goes to the baby. So they always knew this, but then all of a sudden they decided, and this is my personal opinion on it, and it could be wrong, but I think the reason they started to inject pregnant mothers is because people were noticing. So, for example, most people notice after the MMR, and that's because the baby is one. It's usually around age 1. So they will be. Some of them will be talking, some of them will be walking, they'll be laughing, they'll be giggling, they'll be communicating, they'll be playing, they'll be making eye contact, like just healthy. And then they go and get the MMR, and then the next day they regress and they're screaming, and their child is gone like that. They know that something has happened there, and many, many people do. So I think what they did was to give a pregnant woman, so that when the baby comes out damaged, when the baby's born with autism, the baby's born with autism according to them. Do you see? So then there's no blame on the vaccines that because there is no reason to ever give a pregnant woman. They tell you when you're pregnant not to eat fish, right? Because of the mercury. But they're quite happy to put a different, more toxic form of mercury directly into the bloodstream, along with aluminium. When coupled together, the synergistic effect of those two, not even been studied. They've not even been studied, but they will be phenomenal, because that's all we find it when you do go and have a test. So, for example, I'll give you this example because it's a friend of mine, and she's allowed me to use this before. But she knew about vaccines before her first child was born. She did a lot of research, and she knew, what she didn't do was research the vitamin K and didn't even know that her boy had it. She didn't know. So she didn't have any vaccines when she was pregnant. Her eldest was born. As time was going on, because she'd researched it, she could see classic signs, and she thought, well, this is surely not right. But anyway, she sort of ignored it for a little bit, but it was becoming more and more evident as time went on. So what she thought she couldn't figure out, because she knew she hadn't had him vaccinated, and then she went and looked at his little book and his records, and she didn't know, but he did have the vitamin K shot the day he was born, right? So while she was vulnerable, tired, whatever, they injected that little boy with a vitamin K shot, right? Now, in the vitamin K shot, there is 110 micrograms of aluminium alone, regardless of any other ingredient in there. 110 micrograms. According to the according to the FDA, the apparent safety dose of aluminium phosphate in a day is 4 to 6 micrograms. There's 110 in the vitamin K shot, and according to the WHO, there is no safety limit for it because it shouldn't be injected. So basically what she did, she sent some of his hair off. She wanted a toxicology report. She wanted to see, because he was really bad, really off the scale, because obviously you can see that there's different from mild to severe in terms of brain damage from vaccines. We know this, and he was the severe end. So when she sent a strand of his hair off, they did a toxicology report and they sent it back to her, and she sent it to me, and I kid you not, tells you what's in there. The aluminium was actually off the scale, right up to the top. There shouldn't have been any aluminium in him, any at all. So that is absolute proof that the vitamin K shot was what caused his autism. And I mean, there was nowhere else it could have come from at that age. See, even when we're using aluminium and things like that, we're not injecting it, although it is toxic. It's the same with formaldehyde is a bleaching agent they use it to embalm dead bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And they tell you, the National Institute of Health, because it's classed as I think it's a class A carcinogen. Yeah, it might be a class A. They tell you to be careful and not to breathe it in. So this is from a consuming point of view, meaning when we breathe things in, because the body knows how to work, it gets rid of 99% of the toxin anyway. We're only taking in 1%. When you inject it, bypassing all of that, you take in 100% of it. So they're telling you on the National Institute of Health and the Cancer Institutes and everything else, it's even got, if you look at the label of formaldehyde, it's a big toxic thing on the pack, like, do you know what I mean? It is real toxic, and they've put that inside it, and you've got to ask yourself, why? I think next time what I'll do is I'll talk more about the germ and the terrain theory, because that'll make more sense as to why vaccines have, and I'll talk a bit historically about them not eradicating smallpox, not eradicating polio, not eradicating anything. In fact, it's brought more on, isn't it? It has, because there was a little period of time, when we were coming out of the early 1900s, when we were better sanitation-wise and better hygiene and all the rest of it. Little period of time there when everything started to get better and people were much more healthy, and then boom, in comes the vaccinations and causes, I don't even know. 1 in 10,000 in the 1970s were diagnosed with autism. Today, it's 1 in 35, 1 in 28 of them are boys. It's more prevalent in boys, right? So the other thing, which the reason I found out about that actually was because you may or may not have heard of him. Hopefully you have. But he was a scientist at the CDC for some years, and he was the one doing he did the studies on the MMR in African males, right? And what they basically covered it up. So what they did was they fabricated it and they manipulated the data to make it look like there was no connection there. But in 2015, which was 5 years ago, and they didn't mention him on the mainstream media, of course, he blew the whistle and he came out and he gave all his information. And you can find information with him. His name's Dr. William Thompson. Find him, all his videos are on there, and he shows the data as well from where it showed a massive, something like a 340% increase in African males after receiving the MMR, and they buried that information. They just sat on it and pretended that nothing went on. And the mainstream media have not even mentioned. Of course, they haven't mentioned it. They're not going to, are they? But you will find, and he's not the only one.
Catherine?
Yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes left.
All right. Okay. Cool. Oh my God, that went quick.
I just want to ask you a quick question. I want your thoughts on the coronavirus vaccine. We've got 90 seconds before we close up.
COVID-19 is probably going to be the worst vaccine ever to hit the market for so many reasons. And I think we know most of them. One of them is probably going to be the microchip. But beyond that, it's going to cause something massive. It really is. It's going to be one of the most toxic ones there is. Already we know that they've done a trial, was it in Oxford the other day? And it's caused paralysis in somebody. So they're telling you now that they're going to give you an unlicensed, they even admit it's unlicensed, an unlicensed vaccine, which takes no reliability if you die. I mean, you'd have to be mad. You'd have to be crazy to take that vaccine at that point. They're even openly telling you if you die or you get sick, you can't even. So even with the vaccine industry as a whole, they're all licensed vaccines, but they take no liability for if they hurt them. But this one, they're actually telling you it's not even licensed, by the way. But hey, come on, can we try it on you? Absolutely not. No. But I'll go into that a bit more next time, though.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Very, very, very insightful. As Catherine and I have spoken before, really the whole vaccine thing, it's got to be broken down because these are 40-minute conversations. So she's going to come back with some specific things. You guys who know me personally, if there's anything you want related, like she said, she's going to do germ theory, anything to do with anything to do with the brain or of that nature, let me know personally and we'll see if Catherine can get onto it or I'll get onto it. Next week, I think she said she's going to further the vaccine talk, yeah? Is that what you said,
yeah,
Catherine?
because I'll go into like the ingredients a bit more and the corresponding side effects.
Yeah. And I've put down there, I'll put just some of the basic ingredients in the chat, guys, on the right-hand side. This is just in the flu vaccine. You've got, as she said, you've got aluminium salts, formaldehyde, thimerosal, chicken egg proteins, and gelatin.
This is what causes allergies.